It is February of 1967 in a small operating room in Berkeley, California. His patient, a woman named Helen Mortensen, lies unconscious on the table. This is not her first time here. It is her third, severing the connections between her frontal lobes and the rest of her brain. Now, he is back to do it again. Within minutes, something goes wrong. He will never perform surgery again. His name is Walter Freeman, and by the time he lowers that instrument, sometimes doing more than 20 in a single day. He was not trained as a surgeon, a procedure that promised to cure the mind by destroying part of the brain that made them who they were. How did a country with some of the finest medical institutions on Earth allow a single travelling salesman with an ice pick in their desperate attempt to contain it? By the early 20th century, state psychiatric hospitals across the United States were quietly turning into some of the most overcrowded institutions in the country, straining to hold 2,000 or 3,000. Wards designed for quiet convalescence were instead lined wall to wall with iron beds. A single attendant might be responsible for 100 patients or more. Treatment options were nearly non-existent. Doctors had straitjackets, restraints, ice baths, insulin-induced comas, and electroconvulsive therapy. Nothing that reliably calmed the sickest patients. Superintendents running these hospitals were under constant pressure from state legislatures to reduce costs and reduce populations, told to solve it anyway. In the summer of 1935, a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz travelled to London for the Second International Congress of Neurology. Moniz was already a towering figure in his field, sat in the audience for a presentation by two Yale researchers, John Fulton and Carlisle Jacobson. One of their subjects, a chimpanzee named Becky, had been notoriously high-strung. After her frontal lobes were removed, something changed. Moniz, listening intently, reportedly turned to the researchers and asked a question. Within 3 months, back in Lisbon, he had designed an instrument and found his first human patient. What Moniz did not fully grapple with may simply have meant that part of her brain, the part responsible for recognizing failure and reacting to it, had been damaged. But in November of 1935, that distinction was not yet clear. Moniz called the operation a leucotomy. Working with a neurosurgeon named Almeida Lima, he developed an instrument called a leucotome, coring out small sections of the white matter. Moniz performed roughly 20 of these operations in his first months of work. What Moniz did not have was any kind of rigorous, long-term, independent follow-up. News of Moniz's leucotomy spread quickly through international medical circles, in the person of a neurologist named Walter Freeman. Freeman was in his early 40s, ambitious, charismatic, wanted to be the man who changed that. Freeman was not himself a trained surgeon. He recruited a neurosurgeon colleague at George Washington University named James Watts. On September 14, 1936, they performed the first prefrontal lobotomy in the United States. Their patient was a 63-year-old Kansas housewife named Alice Hood Hammett. The operation involved drilling small holes into either side of her skull and using a surgical instrument to sever the connective tissue. Freeman and Watts reported that Alice Hammett seemed calmer. Within just 3 months, they had performed the procedure 20 times. By 1942, that number had climbed past 200. Freeman and Watts published their results with striking confidence. A minority had gotten worse, sometimes fatally. If you're finding this history as unsettling as I did researching it, consider subscribing. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, the appeal of the lobotomy widened well beyond Freeman and Watts' small operating theatre. A calmer patient meant fewer incidents, fewer injuries to staff, and lower costs. Imagine a mother who has watched her adult son cycle through years of violent episodes. How many of them are equipped to ask hard questions about long-term outcomes? Newspapers of the era did much of the persuading, running headlines that likened the procedure to something as routine as treating a toothache. The New York Times itself would eventually cover Freeman's transorbital technique under a headline calling it surgery of the soul. This was, after all, an era flush with genuine medical triumph. Penicillin was saving soldiers. Surgery itself was advancing at a dizzying pace. And yet, even as public enthusiasm grew, the underlying problem kept getting worse. By the mid-1940s, state institutions across the country were housing patient populations that dwarfed anything their original architects had imagined. Journalists and reformers were beginning to publish exposés. Against that backdrop, a treatment that promised to empty out even a fraction of those overflowing wards did not need to be perfect. Freeman began to grow frustrated with the limitations of his own procedure. The Freeman-Watts prefrontal lobotomy required an operating room, a trained surgeon, general anesthesia, and a recovery period of days or weeks. Freeman wanted something faster. The answer came from Italy. Freeman had learned of a psychiatrist named Amaro Fiamberti, who had begun experimenting with reaching the frontal lobes through an entirely different route. Freeman saw in it something far more radical, reportedly testing his technique first on cadavers, using an actual ice pick pulled from his own kitchen drawer. Working largely on his own, Freeman developed what he called the transorbital lobotomy. On January 17, 1946, in his own Washington office, Freeman performed the very first transorbital lobotomy on a 29-year-old housewife named Sally Ellen Ionesco. He rendered her unconscious not with anesthesia, but with electroconvulsive shock, sent her home the same day in a taxi. What could possibly go wrong with a medical procedure a doctor could perform in 10 minutes? If this story is making you rethink how much scrutiny revolutionary medical breakthroughs actually receive, Freeman's transorbital technique horrified his own longtime surgical partner, James Watts, was reportedly disturbed by what he saw as Freeman's transformation of a delicate neurosurgical intervention into something closer to a party trick. By 1947, the disagreement between the two men had grown so severe that their partnership came to an end. Freeman, unbothered, pressed forward alone. He began travelling the country, performing dozens of transorbital lobotomies in rapid succession. In July of 1952 alone, working with the state of West Virginia, Freeman performed 228 transorbital lobotomies in a single 2-week span. Witnesses who later described these sessions recalled Freeman moving from patient to patient without even leaving the room. One person wheeled out as the next was wheeled in. Over the full course of his career, Freeman personally performed or supervised somewhere close to 3,500 lobotomies across 23 states. Nationally, across every hospital and every physician who adopted some version of the procedure, historians estimate that between 40 and 50,000 Americans were lobotomized. But what actually happened to the people who underwent this surgery? A meaningful number of patients did become calmer afterward. Some were able to leave institutions where they had been confined for years and return to some version of life with their families. But calm is not the same as cured, and a great many patients paid a steep price for that calm. Across Freeman and Watts' own early published data, roughly 1 in 7 either suffered serious complications or died as a direct result of the surgery. The most common outcome was patients who survived the operation, but who emerged from it fundamentally changed. Family members frequently described loved ones who returned from the hospital calmer, yes, but also flatter. Doctors of the era sometimes describe this outcome approvingly. Some of the documented cases from this period illustrate both extremes with particular clarity. Genuinely seemed to benefit, whose violent episodes ceased and who were able to hold jobs. There were patients like the young boy named Howard Dully, lobotomized by Walter Freeman in December of 1960 at the age of just 12. Dully would spend the rest of his life navigating the aftermath of that decision. Something essential had been taken from him before he was even old enough to know what it was. His case, and others like it, would eventually force a difficult question into public view. If a 12-year-old boy's worst offense was staying up too late, what exactly was psychosurgery treating? In the summer of 1941, Rosemary Kennedy, the eldest daughter of Joseph and Rose Kennedy, underwent a prefrontal lobotomy performed by Freeman and Watts. She was 23 years old. The surgery, performed with Rosemary conscious and asked to recite prayers and simple songs so the surgeons could gauge how much brain tissue to remove. The surgery went catastrophically wrong. Afterward, Rosemary Kennedy could no longer walk without assistance, could barely speak more than a few words. She spent the rest of her life, more than 6 decades, in institutional care at St. Coletta's School in Wisconsin. Her family did not speak publicly about what had happened to her for years. One of the most closely guarded stories in one of the most famous families in America. When the details eventually became widely known, they landed with enormous force. Here was proof that even wealth, privilege, and access to the finest medical care in the country could not protect a patient. If a lobotomy could go this wrong for a Kennedy, what might it be doing to the tens of thousands of far less visible patients? Criticism of lobotomy did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It built slowly in fragments across more than a decade. Neurologists and psychiatrists who had trained rigorously in the anatomy and function of the brain looked at Freeman's outpatient technique with something close to alarm. Some of Freeman's own professional peers described watching him operate with a mixture of fascination and horror. As the 1940s wore into the 1950s, medical journals began publishing more skeptical assessments of psychosurgery's actual efficacy. Novelists and filmmakers picked up on the growing unease as well, and lobotomy began appearing in popular fiction not as a miracle, but as a symbol of institutional cruelty. Families who had once eagerly sought out the operation for a struggling relative began instead to speak more openly, sometimes decades later, about regret. In 1952, French researchers synthesized a compound called chlorpromazine, and by 1954 it had reached the American market under the brand name Thorazine. For the first time, a psychiatrist facing a violently disturbed or catatonic patient had an option that could be tried, adjusted, or stopped entirely. The demand that had sustained Freeman's cross-country tours began drying up within just a few years. Freeman himself, watching his life's work fall out of favour, refused to accept that pharmacology had simply solved a problem his ice pick never truly could. He relocated to California in 1954, culminating in that fatal operation on Helen Mortensen in February of 1967 and the revocation of his surgical privileges that followed. He died of cancer in 1972, having spent his last years driving around the country in his camper, tracking down former patients. By the time Freeman died, the era he had built was already widely regarded within medicine as a cautionary tale rather than a triumph. Egas Moniz, the procedure's originator, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1949, a decision that remains one of the most disputed in the prize's history. Efforts to have it posthumously revoked, driven in part by families of patients who suffered devastating outcomes, have continued for decades without success. What the lobotomy era exposed was the vulnerability of an entire medical system to the seduction of a treatment that appeared to solve an otherwise unsolvable crisis. It also left behind, uncomfortably, a handful of genuine legacies. The episode helped accelerate the modern development of informed consent standards. What remains, more than 70 years later, is a chapter of American medical history that resists easy resolution. How do we know, in the moment, when medicine's confidence has outpaced its evidence? If this history moved you the way it moved me putting it together, subscribing helps this channel keep telling these stories.